The flight home begins. The sun had begun its descent behind the Atlanta skyline as Dr. Malcolm Price leaned against the terminal window, staring out at the planes lined up like metallic birds waiting for their chance to soar. He sipped from a coffee cup, its contents long cold, a habit born from years of grueling shifts that made time feel like an illusion. The exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, a residue from a 16-hour hospital shift filled with emergencies, triumphs, and heartbreaks. Malcolm was a trauma surgeon, a man accustomed to chaos, but today he felt hollowed out. The weight of his work rarely allowed for respite, and this flight home was supposed to be a chance to recharge before diving back into the relentless rhythm of saving lives. The boarding call for Flight 172 to Chicago echoed through the terminal. Malcolm grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. He had chosen an aisle seat for the legroom, a rare splurge for someone who usually opted for economy's cheapest options. As he approached the gate, he noticed the crowd was a mix of business travelers, families, and the occasional lone passenger like himself. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then again, storms don't always announce their arrival. The plane's cabin was a symphony of muted chaos, the rustling of bags, the chatter of families, and the polite exchanges between strangers settling into tight quarters. Malcolm found his seat, 8C, tucked between a mother with a restless toddler and a man in a business suit, typing furiously on a laptop. He smiled politely at them before stowing his bag in the overhead compartment. He sat down, exhaling deeply. This was supposed to be his quiet moment, a rare chance to simply exist without the demands of his profession pressing against his chest. But his peace was short-lived. "Excuse me, sir." Malcolm turned to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle, her uniform immaculate, her expression sharp. Her name tag read K. Jennings. She had an air of authority that felt more rehearsed than genuine. "Yes?" he asked, his voice calm, betraying none of his fatigue. "Your bag is protruding slightly into the aisle," she said, her tone clipped. "It needs to be fully secured." Malcolm glanced up at the bag. It was tucked neatly in the overhead bin, barely noticeable. He stood anyway, adjusting it with practiced care. Years in medicine had taught him to pick his battles, and this wasn't one worth fighting. He nodded at her. "There you go." Jennings lingered for a moment, her eyes scanning him with an intensity that felt unwarranted. Malcolm returned to his seat, the brief interaction already forgotten. But the tension in the air remained, like the faint hum of an approaching storm. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes. His mind wandered to the patients he treated that day. A young girl who had survived a car accident, a man with a gunshot wound clinging to life, and a woman who hadn't made it. Their faces blurred together in his memory, a tapestry of lives that he'd fought for, but couldn't always save. The plane lifted off, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Jennings moved up and down the aisle with mechanical precision, distributing drinks and snacks. Malcolm's eyes fluttered open when she approached his row. "Something to drink?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "Just water, please," Malcolm replied. She poured the water and handed it to him, her hand steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Disdain, perhaps. Malcolm brushed it off, focusing instead on the coolness of the water as he drank. But then it happened. Jennings turned abruptly, her tray shifting as she moved too quickly. The water from another passenger's cup spilled, splashing onto Malcolm's shirt. She froze, her eyes narrowing, but her expression didn't soften. "Sorry," she said, though her tone lacked any real apology. Malcolm grabbed a napkin from his tray, dabbing at the water. "It's fine," he said, his voice even. "Accidents happen." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary before she moved on. Malcolm noticed the mother beside him glancing at him sympathetically. He offered her a small smile, but inside, he felt the weight of something unspoken growing heavier. As the flight continued, Jennings's behavior became increasingly erratic. She hovered near Malcolm's row, her movements sharp and deliberate. She seemed to find reasons to address him, adjusting his tray table, checking the overhead bin again, even commenting on the positioning of his feet. By the third interaction, the man in the business suit beside Malcolm leaned over and whispered, "What's her deal?" Malcolm shrugged, trying to keep his irritation in check. "No idea." The final straw came when Jennings stopped in the middle of the aisle, her voice louder than necessary. "Sir, if you can't follow basic safety protocols, we may have a problem." The cabin fell silent. Passengers turned to look, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. He knew this game. He had seen it play out in hospital boardrooms, at airport security checkpoints, in countless subtle interactions throughout his life. He raised his hands, palms up, a gesture of peace. "I'm not sure what you mean. Everything is secured." Jennings's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just keep it that way," she said before walking away. The plane descended into Chicago, and Malcolm's relief at being close to home was overshadowed by the events of the flight. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Jennings approached again, this time standing directly in front of him. "Sir," she began, her voice low but firm, "I need to have a word with you before you deboard." Malcolm looked at her, his exhaustion giving way to a steely resolve. "If this is about my compliance with safety protocols, I'd like to address it with the captain." Her eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by his calm defiance. Before she could respond, another flight attendant approached, a senior member with a more composed demeanor. "Is there an issue here?" the woman asked, her gaze flicking between Malcolm and Jennings. "Yes," Malcolm said before Jennings could speak. "I've been targeted throughout this flight without cause. I'd like to speak with the captain." Passengers around them began murmuring, their attention now fully on the interaction. The senior attendant nodded. "Of course, sir. Please wait here." As the captain emerged from the cockpit, the tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. Malcolm met the captain's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'd like to report inappropriate conduct by a member of your crew," he said. The captain listened, his face impassive but attentive. Nearby, a passenger held up their phone. "I recorded some of it," they said. "You might want to see this." Jennings paled, her confidence visibly shaken. The captain nodded at the passenger. "Please share that with me." As the flight attendants escorted Jennings away, Malcolm sat back in his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him. The storm had broken, but he knew this was just the beginning. The ground awakens. As the plane taxied to the gate, the hum of engines felt louder than usual. The quiet tension in the cabin was palpable, as if the air itself held its breath. Passengers glanced at Malcolm Price, some with curiosity, others with veiled concern. Jennings had been led away by airport security moments earlier, her usually crisp demeanor shattered, but her departure left a storm of emotions brewing within the cabin. Malcolm remained seated, his shoulders square and his hands resting calmly on his lap. His exterior betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside him. This wasn't his first encounter with unwarranted scrutiny or overt hostility. It was just the first time it had happened so publicly. A young woman sitting across the aisle leaned toward him. Her eyes were wide with concern, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Malcolm turned to her and gave a small nod. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. His shirt was still damp from the spilled water, and the memory of Jennings's tone echoed in his mind. The captain approached him as the passengers began gathering their belongings. "Dr. Price," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Captain Harris. I'd like to personally apologize for what you experienced during this flight." Malcolm shook his hand, appreciating the gesture but aware of the weight behind it. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice steady. "I'd like to ensure this incident is properly documented." "Of course," the captain replied. "We'll follow protocol and begin an investigation immediately. A representative from our airline will meet you at the gate to discuss the next steps." Passengers nearby listened in, their expressions a mix of empathy and discomfort. Malcolm noticed some of them stealing glances at him as if they were trying to make sense of the situation, piecing together their own narratives from fragments of the truth. The walkway leading into the terminal felt surreal. Malcolm stepped off the plane into the fluorescent-lit corridor, a space that seemed both too vast and too confining. A man in a tailored suit was waiting near the gate, holding a clipboard. His name tag read James Caldwell, Passenger Relations Manager. "Dr. Price," Caldwell began, extending a hand. "I'm here to ensure that we handle this matter appropriately. May I escort you to a private lounge where we can discuss further?" Malcolm hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd of passengers filtering out of the gate. The murmurs and furtive glances followed him like shadows. He nodded. "Lead the way." As they walked, Caldwell spoke with a measured tone, carefully balancing empathy with corporate detachment. "I want to express our deepest apologies for the events on board. We take these matters very seriously." "Do you?" Malcolm asked, his voice calm but pointed. "Or do you just say that because it's what you're supposed to say?" Caldwell faltered for a moment before regaining his composure. "We are committed to addressing this incident thoroughly." They entered a private lounge, a small space furnished with leather chairs and a table set with bottled water and neatly arranged snacks. Caldwell gestured for Malcolm to sit, then took the seat across from him. "Dr. Price," Caldwell began, "we've already reviewed preliminary reports from the flight crew. While I can't comment on personnel actions at this time, I assure you that disciplinary measures are being considered." "Considered?" Malcolm asked, his tone sharpening. "I was publicly humiliated and targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with safety or protocol. I've spent my entire life navigating spaces like this, spaces where I'm viewed as a threat until proven otherwise. This was more than an isolated incident." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your frustration." "No," Malcolm interjected, his voice firm but controlled. "You understand that this is a liability for your airline. That's not the same as understanding what I experienced." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Caldwell nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he admitted. "I can't fully understand, but I want to help. We'll cover your ticket cost, offer additional compensation, and ensure this is investigated." "Compensation doesn't erase what happened," Malcolm replied. "It doesn't change the fact that I have to carry the weight of this every day." Caldwell remained silent, his corporate script failing him. After the meeting, Malcolm retrieved his bag and stepped out into the Chicago night. The crisp air bit at his skin, but it felt refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of the plane and lounge. He hailed a cab, sinking into the backseat as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his colleagues, Dr. Lila Winters. "Just saw something about you on Twitter. Are you okay?" Malcolm frowned, opening the app. The video of Jennings berating him had already gone viral. Captions framed the incident in various ways. "Doctor harassed by flight attendant," or "racial bias at 30,000 feet." The comments were a battlefield, ranging from outrage to dismissive skepticism. Another overreaction. One user wrote, "Why is everything about race? This is why people don't trust airlines anymore," another said. Malcolm closed the app, his stomach tightening. He leaned his head against the window, trying to push away the noise, but he couldn't escape the thought that his story was no longer his own. The next morning, Malcolm sat in his living room, the sunlight streaming through the blinds. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table. His wife, Gabrielle, entered the room, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I saw the video," she said, sitting beside him. "It's everywhere." "I didn't ask for this," Malcolm said quietly. "I just wanted to get home." "I know," Gabrielle replied, placing a hand on his arm. "But now it's bigger than that. People are paying attention." "Are they?" Malcolm asked. "Or are they just looking for something to argue about?" Gabrielle met his gaze, You've spent your life helping people. Maybe this is another way to help, by speaking up. Malcolm shook his head. I'm a doctor, Gabby, not an activist. You're a man who was wronged, she said. And you're not the first. Maybe if you speak out, you can make it harder for this to happen again. Her words lingered, intertwining with his own doubts and frustrations. Malcolm wasn't sure he wanted to become the face of a larger fight, but he also couldn't ignore the voices of those who had reached out, sharing their own stories of indignities endured in silence. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received a call from a journalist with a national news outlet. Her voice was professional yet empathetic, her questions thoughtful. She wanted to tell his story, not just the incident on the plane, but the broader context of what it meant to navigate a world that often saw him as other. Do you think this was about race? She asked. Malcolm hesitated. I think it's about power, he said finally. And in this country, power is often tied to race. The interview ended with the promise of a published piece in the coming days. As Malcolm hung up, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. He didn't know if speaking out would make a difference, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. The storm had followed him to the ground, but Malcolm Price was ready to face it head-on. The storm brews. The days following Malcolm's return to Chicago unfolded like an unraveling thread, each moment pulling him deeper into the eye of a storm he hadn't asked for. The video of his confrontation with the flight attendant had reached millions, and his name was now part of a national conversation that alternated between outrage, sympathy, and willful misunderstanding. Malcolm hadn't returned to the hospital yet. His supervisors had suggested he take some time off to process and reflect. Though their words were framed as concern, Malcolm suspected the real reason was to shield the institution from the swirling controversy. He sat in his modest home office, scrolling through the countless emails and messages he'd received. They ranged from heartfelt support to venomous hatred. One stood out. Stay in your lane, doctor. No one cares about your sob story. He closed his laptop with a sigh, leaning back in his chair. His wife, Gabrielle, appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. You're brooding, she said, setting one mug down in front of him. I'm thinking, he corrected, though his tone was light. He took the tea gratefully, the warmth of the mug grounding him. You're wondering if you made the right choice by speaking up, she said, sitting on the edge of his desk. Malcolm nodded. Every time I see the comments or the news, I wonder if I've just made things worse. People are twisting the narrative. It's not about what happened anymore. It's about what they want it to mean. Gabrielle reached out, her hand warm on his shoulder. You can't control how people interpret it, but you've already done something important. People are talking about it. That's the problem, Malcolm muttered. They're talking, but no one's listening. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received a call from his friend and mentor, Dr. Alan Shaw, a senior physician at the hospital and a trusted confidant. Alan's voice was a comforting baritone, tinged with a wisdom earned through decades of navigating the complexities of both medicine and life. Malcolm, Alan began, I saw the news. I've been meaning to call. I appreciate it, Malcolm said, pacing his living room. It's been a lot. I can imagine, Alan replied. But listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. The hospital board is meeting tomorrow, and your name's on the agenda. Malcolm stopped in his tracks. Why? I'm not even at work right now. Alan sighed. They're concerned about the attention this is bringing to the hospital. You know how these things go. They'll want to position themselves as neutral, or worse, distance themselves entirely. Malcolm felt a familiar surge of frustration. So I speak up about something that shouldn't have happened, and now I'm the problem. You're not the problem, Alan said firmly. But you need to be prepared. These situations can get messy fast. Make sure you have your facts straight, and don't let them spin this into something it's not. Malcolm thanked Alan for the warning, but his mind was already racing. The thought of sitting in a room full of executives who saw him as a liability made his stomach churn. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the hospital boardroom, dressed in a sharp navy suit. Gabrielle had insisted he wear it, saying, "You need to remind them who you are before they try to tell you who you're not." The boardroom was a sterile space dominated by a long mahogany table. At one end sat Dr. Judith Warren, the hospital's chief administrator, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel and a few board members. Alan was there too, offering Malcolm a reassuring nod as he entered. "Dr. Price," Warren began, her tone polite but clipped. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice." Malcolm nodded, taking the seat. "Of course, I'd like to know why I'm here." Warren folded her hands on the table, her expression carefully neutral. "As you're aware, the incident on your flight has garnered significant public attention. While we support your right to address what happened, the hospital must also consider its reputation and the potential impact on our community." "And what exactly does that mean?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice steady. The legal counsel, a wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose, interjected. "It means we need to ensure that your personal actions don't inadvertently reflect on the hospital as an institution." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "So let me get this straight. I'm harassed on a flight, and now you're worried about how that makes you look." Warren leaned forward slightly. "We're not here to place blame, Dr. Price. We're here to protect the hospital and its mission." Malcolm met her gaze, unflinching. "If the hospital's mission is to protect the vulnerable, then it should be standing with me, not trying to distance itself." Alan cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Dr. Price has always conducted himself with professionalism and integrity. I think we should focus on supporting him rather than complicating an already difficult situation." Warren's expression softened slightly, but the tension in the room remained. "We'll take your points into consideration, Dr. Price," she said finally. "Thank you for coming." As Malcolm left the boardroom, he felt both relief and anger. The meeting had been a thinly veiled attempt to silence him, but he refused to let them succeed. That evening, Malcolm received another call, this time from the advocacy group Equity Now, which had reached out to him before. Their director, a woman named Simone Carter, spoke with a clarity and conviction that immediately commanded attention. "Dr. Price," she began, "I understand if you're hesitant to step into the spotlight, but your story is already out there. If you're willing, we'd like to help you amplify it in a way that creates real change." Malcolm hesitated. "What does that look like?" "It starts with sharing your voice on a broader platform," Simone explained. "Interviews, panels, maybe even congressional testimony. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been in your position and didn't have the chance to speak out." The idea was daunting, but Malcolm couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had a platform now, whether he wanted it or not. And maybe, just maybe, he could use it to make a difference. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Take your time," Simone replied. "But remember, silence is its own kind of message." As the days passed, Malcolm began to see his story take on a life of its own. News outlets continued to cover the incident, with some framing it as a call to action and others as a point of controversy. Social media debates raged on, but amidst the noise, Malcolm noticed something powerful. People were sharing their own stories. A single tweet stood out to him. "I've been there, Dr. Price. Thank you for speaking up. We need more voices like yours." For the first time since the flight, Malcolm felt a spark of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a movement, a collective effort to challenge the systems that perpetuated injustice. The storm was still brewing, but Malcolm Price was no longer afraid. He was ready to face it, one step at a time, rising above the noise. The city's first light filtered through the blinds as Dr. Malcolm Price sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in front of him. The morning was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside. But in Malcolm's mind, the noise of the past week roared like a storm. The emails, calls, and comments hadn't stopped. His phone had become a portal to a whirlwind of support, criticism, and expectation. People he'd never met saw him as a symbol now, a representative of something much larger than himself. Gabrielle entered the room, her hair wrapped in a scarf, still wearing her robe. She placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You've been sitting here for an hour," she said softly. "What's on your mind?" Malcolm sighed, rubbing his temple. "Everything. The messages, the hospital, the media. I didn't ask for this, Gabby. I didn't want to become a cause." "You didn't choose this," Gabrielle said, pulling out a chair to sit across from him. "But now that it's here, you have a choice in how you respond." "That's the part that's hard," Malcolm admitted. "If I speak up, I risk everything. My career, my peace. But if I stay quiet, it feels like I'm letting them win." Gabrielle leaned forward, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this. You've already inspired people, Malcolm. Don't let fear stop you from seeing it through." Her words stayed with him as he prepared for the day ahead. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he knew Gabrielle was right. This was bigger than him now, and there was no turning back. Later that day, Malcolm met with Simone Carter from Equity Now at a downtown cafe. The space was cozy but bustling, a hum of conversation, and clinking cups filling the air. Simone was a striking woman in her early 40s, her presence commanding yet approachable. She greeted Malcolm with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Dr. Price," she began, motioning for him to sit. "I've been following your story closely. I want to start by saying how much I admired your courage." Malcolm nodded, grateful for her sincerity. "Thank you. But I'm not sure if it's courage or just exhaustion." Simone chuckled. "Sometimes they're the same thing. Either way, you've sparked a conversation that needs to happen. And I think you're in a unique position to push it forward." "What exactly does that look like?" Malcolm asked, leaning back in his chair. Simone's expression grew serious. "It means stepping into the spotlight intentionally. You've already become a symbol of resilience and justice, but symbols can fade if they're not backed by action. We want to help you craft a message, something that goes beyond the incident on the plane and speaks to the larger issues at play." Malcolm sipped his coffee, considering her words. "I'm a doctor, not an activist." Simone leaned forward. "That's precisely why your voice matters. You're not coming from a place of theory or abstraction. You've lived it. People connect with that authenticity." He looked out the window, watching the stream of pedestrians moving through the city. "I'm not sure where to start." Simone smiled. "That's where we come in. We'll guide you. You're not alone in this." For the first time since the incident, Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a storm to weather, but an opportunity to build something meaningful. Simone's team wasted no time. Over the next week, Malcolm participated in strategy sessions, media training, and panel discussions. They helped him refine his message, emphasizing not just what had happened, but why it mattered. One evening, Malcolm found himself on a live-streamed panel hosted by a prominent social justice organization. The other participants included an attorney specializing in civil rights cases, a professor of sociology, and a community activist. The moderator opened the discussion with a brief introduction of each panelist before turning to Malcolm. "Dr. Price, your story has resonated with millions. Can you share what this experience has taught you so far?" Malcolm took a deep breath before speaking. "This experience has been a harsh reminder of how ingrained bias and power dynamics are in our society. But it's also shown me the strength of collective voices. The outpouring of support I've received isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or unfairly targeted." The discussion shifted to systemic issues, from workplace discrimination to implicit bias in institutions. Malcolm spoke with a quiet but firm conviction, drawing from both his personal experiences and his work as a physician. "People often ask if what happened to me was about race," he said at one point. "My answer is that it's about power. In this country, power is often tied to race. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about a system that allows those actions to happen without accountability. The audience's response was immediate. The chat flooded with messages of support, personal stories, and calls for action. Malcolm felt both humbled and overwhelmed by the impact of his words. The next morning, Malcolm's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The panel discussion had gone viral, and his words were being quoted across social media and news outlets. Some headlines praised his eloquence and bravery, while others accused him of playing the victim or stirring the pot. Malcolm read through the comments with a mix of pride and frustration. Gabrielle sat beside him, scrolling on her own phone. "Don't let the trolls get to you," she said. "They're just loud, not right." "I know," Malcolm replied, "but it's hard not to feel the weight of it all." Gabrielle placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing something important, Malcolm. Focus on the people who are listening, not the ones shouting to drown you out." That afternoon, Malcolm received a call from an unexpected source, Captain Harris, the pilot from his flight. His voice was calm but carried a hint of unease. "Dr. Price," Harris began, "I wanted to check in. I've been following what's happening, and I wanted to say, I admire how you're handling this." "Thank you," Malcolm said. "That means a lot." "I've also been contacted by the airline," Harris continued. "They're conducting an internal investigation, and I've given my statement. I told them the truth, that what happened was unacceptable and unprovoked." Malcolm was silent for a moment, the weight of Harris's words sinking in. "I appreciate your honesty, Captain. It makes a difference. I just wanted you to know that not everyone in that cabin was blind to what was happening," Harris said. "Good luck, Dr. Price. You're doing the right thing." After the call ended, Malcolm sat in silence, processing the unexpected validation. For so long, it had felt like he was carrying this burden alone. But now he realized he wasn't. The storm was still raging, but Malcolm was no longer fighting it alone. With each step forward, he felt a little stronger, a little more ready to face what came next. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. And Malcolm Price was at its center. The turning tide. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light, a small desk lamp that cast long shadows across Dr. Malcolm Price's study. His laptop screen glowed, displaying an inbox filled with hundreds of unread emails. The messages ranged from heartfelt support to venomous attacks, each one a reminder of the spotlight he now found himself under. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The week had been a whirlwind: interviews, panels, and a growing network of people who saw him as a symbol of something larger. Yet with every step forward, the weight of the expectations grew heavier. He glanced at his phone, where a notification from Simone Carter of Equity now awaited. She had arranged a meeting with a group of civil rights leaders who wanted to collaborate with Malcolm on a broader initiative. He had agreed to attend, but doubt lingered in the back of his mind. "Am I really the right person for this?" he muttered to himself. Gabrielle entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She placed one in front of him, then sat on the edge of his desk. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone gentle. Malcolm gestured toward the screen. "This. All of this. I'm a doctor, Gabby. I didn't sign up to be a public figure." Gabrielle took a sip of her tea, then met his gaze. "No, you didn't. But life doesn't always let us choose our battles. Sometimes they choose us." Her words resonated, but the uncertainty remained. Malcolm had spent his life focused on healing others. This new role, activist, advocate, symbol, felt foreign, and the stakes felt impossibly high. The following afternoon, Malcolm arrived at the headquarters of Equity Now for the meeting Simone had arranged. The building was a sleek, modern space that exuded both professionalism and purpose. He was greeted by a young woman who led him to a conference room, where Simone and several others were already seated. "Dr. Price," Simone said warmly, standing to greet him. "Thank you for coming." Malcolm nodded, taking the seat. Around the table were community leaders, attorneys, and activists, each of them carrying a distinct air of determination. "We've been discussing your story and the impact it's had," Simone began. "It's rare for a single incident to capture this much attention, but it's clear that your experience has struck a chord." One of the attorneys, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward. "Your case isn't just about what happened on that flight. It's about systemic issues, bias, power, and accountability. We believe your voice could be pivotal in addressing these broader problems." "What exactly are you proposing?" Malcolm asked, his tone measured. Simone exchanged a glance with the others before responding. "We'd like to launch an initiative centered around your story. It would focus on advocating for stronger accountability measures in corporate and public spaces, as well as promoting education on implicit bias." Malcolm frowned. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I'm a doctor, not an activist." "That's precisely why you're the right person," the attorney interjected. "Your background gives you credibility. People see you as someone who's worked hard, someone who's earned respect, and yet still faced this injustice. That's a powerful narrative." The room fell silent as Malcolm considered their words. He thought about the patients he had treated, the countless hours spent in operating rooms, and the quiet battles he had fought simply to be seen and respected in his field. Perhaps this was an extension of that fight, a chance to heal not just individuals, but a fractured system. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Simone smiled. "That's all we ask." As Malcolm left the meeting, he was met with the cool embrace of the evening air. The city buzzed around him, its rhythm steady and unyielding. He found himself walking aimlessly, his thoughts swirling. He passed a park where children played, their laughter echoing through the air. Nearby, a group of young men sat on a bench, their conversation animated. One of them noticed Malcolm and approached him. "Excuse me," the young man said hesitantly. "You're Dr. Price, right?" Malcolm nodded. "I am." "I just wanted to say thank you," the young man continued. "What you're doing, it means a lot. People like me, we see you, and it gives us hope." Malcolm was taken aback, but he managed a small smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The encounter stayed with him as he returned home. It was a reminder that his story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. The next day, Malcolm received an invitation to appear on a major news program. The producer framed it as an opportunity to share his perspective and discuss the broader implications of his experience. Malcolm hesitated but eventually agreed, knowing it was a chance to reach a wider audience. The studio was a whirlwind of activity, cameras, lights, and the constant hum of voices. Malcolm was ushered into a chair opposite the host, a polished journalist with a reputation for asking tough questions. "Dr. Price," the host began, "your story has sparked a national conversation. How does it feel to find yourself at the center of this dialogue?" Malcolm took a moment before responding. "It's overwhelming, to be honest. I never wanted to be in the spotlight, but I've come to realize that this isn't just about me. It's about a system that needs to change." The host nodded. "Some critics have accused you of overreacting, of making this about race when it could have been a misunderstanding. How do you respond to that?" Malcolm's expression hardened slightly. It's easy to dismiss something as a misunderstanding when it doesn't affect you. But for people like me, these misunderstandings are part of a larger pattern, a pattern of bias and power imbalances that we face every day. The interview continued, with Malcolm sharing his insights and experiences. By the end, the host seemed genuinely moved, thanking him for his honesty and courage. That evening, Malcolm returned home to find Gabrielle waiting for him. She had watched the interview and was beaming with pride. "You were incredible," she said, embracing him. "You spoke your truth, and people are listening." Malcolm exhaled deeply, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already is," Gabrielle said. "You're showing people that it's okay to stand up, even when it's hard." As Malcolm sat down, He realized that the tide was beginning to turn. The storm was still raging, but he was no longer just weathering it. He was steering it, shaping its direction. For the first time, he felt not just the weight of expectation, but the promise of possibility. This wasn't just a fight, it was a journey. And Malcolm Price was ready to see it through to the end. A new horizon. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Malcolm Price's study, casting long shadows over the desk cluttered with papers, notebooks, and his ever-buzzing phone. His coffee had gone cold again, untouched as his mind raced. Today marked a turning point. After weeks of interviews, panel discussions, and sleepless nights, he was set to deliver a speech at a national summit on systemic bias and accountability. The event had grown beyond anything Malcolm could have anticipated. What started as a single flight had spiraled into a movement, with his name at the center. Messages of solidarity poured in from around the world. Letters from young professionals who saw themselves in his story, parents thanking him for setting an example, and others simply saying, "We're with you." But not all the messages were kind. The vitriol from detractors hadn't ceased, their voices echoing in the dark corners of social media. Malcolm had stopped reading the comments weeks ago, but their sting lingered in his mind. Doubts crept in as he prepared his notes for the speech. What if I say the wrong thing? What if this does more harm than good? Gabrielle walked into the room, her steady presence calming him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his. "You've been doubting yourself since this began," she said softly. "But look at what you've accomplished. You've already made an impact, Malcolm. This speech is just the next step." He nodded, her words giving him the strength he needed. "You're coming, right?" he asked. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," she said, her smile reassuring. The summit was held in a sprawling conference center downtown, its modern glass facade gleaming in the sunlight. As Malcolm entered the building, he was met by Simone Carter and a few members of her team from Equity Now. They handed him a small lapel microphone and ushered him backstage, where he could hear the murmur of the audience filling the auditorium. Simone placed a hand on his arm. "You're going to be great," she said. "Just speak from the heart. That's what people connect with." Malcolm nodded, taking a deep breath. The weight of the moment settled over him, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt purposeful. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled with attendees ranging from activists and community leaders to students and corporate executives. The stage was minimalist, with a single podium and a large screen behind it displaying the event's theme: Bridging the Divide, Accountability, Equity, and Action. Malcolm stepped onto the stage, his heartbeat steady but firm. The room fell silent as he approached the podium, his presence commanding attention. He adjusted the microphone, then looked out at the sea of faces before him. "Good morning," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "When I boarded a flight a few weeks ago, I thought it would be just another ordinary trip. I was tired, worn out from a long shift, and looking forward to a quiet journey home. But that flight turned into something much bigger than I could have imagined." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "What happened to me on that plane wasn't unique. It wasn't the first time I've been made to feel like I didn't belong, and I know it won't be the last. But what made this experience different was the response. Not just my own, but the collective response of so many people who saw themselves in my story." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. "This isn't about one flight or one incident," Malcolm continued. "It's about a system that allows biases to go unchecked, that permits those in positions of power to act without accountability. It's about the small, insidious ways people are made to feel less than, on planes, in workplaces, in schools, and in countless other spaces." He looked out at the crowd, his voice growing stronger. "But here's the thing about storms. They can destroy, but they can also cleanse. They can wash away the old, broken ways and make room for something new. That's what this moment is about. It's about choosing to rebuild, not with the same flawed materials, but with something stronger, more just, more equitable." The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy surging through the space. Malcolm let it settle before continuing. "Change doesn't come easy," he said. "It takes courage, persistence, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that change is possible. It starts with each of us, in our own spheres of influence, holding ourselves and others accountable." He closed with a call to action. "So I ask you all, what can you do? What conversations can you start? What systems can you challenge? Together, we have the power to create a world where stories like mine are no longer necessary. Let's make that world a reality." The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to reverberate through Malcolm's chest. As he stepped off the stage, Simone met him with a wide smile. "You nailed it," she said. Gabrielle was waiting for him in the wings, her eyes glistening with pride. "I told you," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "You were incredible." The rest of the summit was a blur of conversations, interviews, and new connections. Malcolm was approached by corporate leaders wanting to implement anti-bias training, activists seeking partnerships, and young professionals thanking him for his courage. As the day wound down, Malcolm found a quiet corner to reflect. The storm that had begun on that flight had grown into something far larger than he ever could have anticipated. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a purpose. Weeks later, Malcolm returned to his work at the hospital, balancing his medical career with his new role as an advocate for equity and justice. His story continued to inspire others, but he never lost sight of his roots, of the patients who relied on him, and the reason he had chosen this path in the first place. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing charts, a young intern knocked on his door. "Dr. Price," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been following your story, and it's given me the courage to keep going, even when things feel impossible." Malcolm smiled, his heart full. "Thank you," he said. "And remember, no matter how hard it gets, you belong here." As the intern left, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. The storm had changed him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger, more resolute. The horizon was no longer dark. It was filled with the light of possibility, and Malcolm Price was ready to embrace it. Closing the chapter. The evening sunlight bathed the hospital corridor in warm hues as Dr. Malcolm Price walked toward the exit. His shift had ended, but his thoughts lingered on the day's events, routine surgeries, quiet victories, and the steady hum of life in a place that balanced between chaos and care. The storm that had upended his life weeks ago now felt like a distant memory, though its echoes remained. As he stepped outside, the crisp air carried a sense of renewal. Malcolm noticed a group of hospital staff chatting near the entrance. They paused, turning toward him with expressions of gratitude and admiration. "Dr. Price," one of the nurses said, stepping forward, "I just wanted to say that your speech at the summit really resonated with me. It made me reflect on how we treat each other, even in small moments." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, his voice warm. "That means a lot." Another nurse chimed in. "You've given us something to think about, not just as professionals, but as people." Malcolm nodded, humbled by their words. He had always believed that change began with conversations, and seeing its impact within his own workplace was a reminder of why he had chosen to speak out. Later that night, Malcolm sat on the couch with Gabrielle, a fire crackling in the hearth. The atmosphere was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks. Gabrielle rested her head on his shoulder, her presence a steadying force. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking about what you said in your speech, about rebuilding with something stronger." Malcolm turned to her, curious. "What about it?" "I think you're doing that," she said, meeting his gaze. "Not just out there, with the world watching, but here too. You've become a better version of yourself through this. A stronger, more focused you." Malcolm smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I couldn't have done it without you. You'd have figured it out," she teased. "But I'm glad I was here for the ride." For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a profound sense of calm. The storm that had swept through his life had left behind something unexpected: clarity. He understood now that his journey wasn't just about responding to one incident. It was about using that moment as a catalyst for something greater. A few days later, Malcolm received an email from Equity Now. Simon Carter had invited him to join their board of advisors, a role that would allow him to continue advocating for change without compromising his medical career. He accepted the offer, seeing it as a way to stay connected to the movement he had unintentionally ignited. His life found a new rhythm, balancing his work as a trauma surgeon with his role as an advocate. The two worlds, though distinct, felt intertwined. Each patient he treated reminded him of the humanity he fought to protect, while every speech he gave reinforced his commitment to equity and justice. Months passed, and the world moved on, as it always did. The viral video that had sparked the storm became a footnote in a larger narrative, but its ripples continued to spread. Policies were enacted at the airline to address implicit bias. Corporate leaders adopted new accountability measures, and discussions about systemic inequities gained momentum in public spaces. One evening, Malcolm stood in front of his bathroom mirror, tying his tie for a formal gala hosted by Equity Now. The event was a celebration of progress, honoring individuals who had contributed to meaningful change. Gabrielle entered the room, adjusting her earrings, and smiled at him through the mirror. "Nervous?" she asked. "A little," he admitted, "but it's a good kind of nervous." The gala was a glittering affair, filled with luminaries from various fields. Malcolm took the stage to deliver a brief speech, his words heartfelt and reflective. "Tonight isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us, about what we can achieve when we refuse to stay silent. Change is never easy, but it's always worth it. And while the work is far from over, I believe we're moving in the right direction." The audience erupted into applause, and Malcolm felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a moment to pause, to reflect, and to celebrate how far they had come. As the night wound down, Malcolm and Gabrielle stood on the balcony of the event venue, overlooking the city lights. The air was cool, and the hum of distant traffic filled the silence between them. "You've come a long way," Gabrielle said, her voice filled with pride. "We both have," Malcolm replied, taking her hand. "This isn't just my journey, it's ours." They stood there for a while, the weight of the past months lifting as they looked toward the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky filled with stars and the promise of a new dawn. For Malcolm Price, the journey wasn't about weathering the storm, it was about finding purpose in its wake. And as he stood there, hand in hand with Gabrielle, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.